What is the number one issue that causes illness that people aren't talking about? Hi, I'm Dr. Eric Westman, and welcome to my channel where I review and debunk nutritional information online. In this video, we're going to be looking at snippets, excerpts of an extended interview that Dr. Mark Hyman of the Cleveland Clinic did with RFK Jr., who at the time was a candidate for president, and now it looks like he might be in the government in charge of health and human services if he gets through the panel of scrutiny of the Congress. But I found it a very interesting video, and taking time to really learn about what RFK Jr. and Mark Hyman, a doctor, colleague of mine at Cleveland Clinic, to what they say, what is the cause of all of these health problems, and maybe there's something we can do about it. So let's listen in to the video, Dr. Mark Hyman and RFK Jr. Before we dive into today's video, I want to invite you to take keto nutritionist Amy Berger's free masterclass, The Secrets to Breaking Keto Fat Loss Stalls. If you're doing all the right things but stubborn weight still won't budge, then Amy's masterclass is for you. See the link in the description to sign up.
According to new data, 93.2% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy, which means they have either high blood sugar, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, or overweight, or have had a heart attack or stroke. 6 in 10 Americans have a chronic disease. Large part, this is due to the explosion of ultra-processed food over the last 20, 30 years that drives poor metabolic health. It's also affecting our mental health crisis, increasing, a lot of our depression, anxiety, polarization, violence, aggression, all because of the food we're eating. And the cost is staggering. As president, you have to deal with our budget. And, $4.3 trillion are spent every year on healthcare. Now, $1 in $5 in our economy. And it leads to also huge amounts of lost productivity, with billions of dollars a year in lost productivity.
So there's a problem. Dr. Hyman can give all of those statistics pretty easily. There's a big problem. And then the idea of targeting ultra-processed food as the cause, well, we called it junk food growing up, didn't we? And it's the same junk food, or maybe it's even worse today. And so what RFK Jr. is talking about is transparency, to let people know that the food that is in the grocery store might be harmful to them. And that seems like a fine thing to have happen, doesn't it?
So would you consider this a national emergency? And as president, how would you begin to really address this problem?
Yeah, this is one of the reasons, the key reasons that I ran for president, Mark, to end this chronic disease epidemic and to restore Americans to good health. When my uncle was president in 1960, he would go back and look at his speeches and his thoughts, man, and he was extraordinarily distressed at that point that we were losing ground to Europeans.
Yeah, so it is a national emergency. When you look around, everyone, it seems like everyone has a problem. Look at the mall, go to the beach. So it's a national emergency because it's to the point where the U.S. soldiers are not war worthy. There are people now who are too heavy to be worthy to be in combat, in battle. So our armed forces are having trouble recruiting people because of the obesity. It's a crisis, it's an epidemic and emergency because of the money spent on type 2 diabetes now. And if there was no way to reverse the type 2 diabetes, we'd say that it's really just a shame. But we know how to reverse the type 2 diabetes. The problem is it has to do with lifestyle and not medications. Ultra-processed food being probably the main thing, and I would always want you to think sugar and ultra-processed food, because sugar is the main part of the problem in the ultra-processed food. But so there's a big problem, and it is a national emergency. To have a politician be interested in this, albeit in campaign speeches, is really noteworthy.
And if he could look at Americans today, he would be in shock, because we are so sick, as you say. The obesity when he was in office, obesity was at 13%. Today it's at 42%, 45%, 75% of Americans are overweight. When he was in office, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. By 1986, 11.8%. So it had doubled between 1960 and 1986. It's 26 years. By 2006, it was at 54%. And we don't really know what the numbers are right now because of the, I would say, purposeful data chaos that comes out of NIH that they will not give us.
Do you remember the Presidential Fitness Award? Did you have to do those, I think it was push-ups and pull-ups, and I have memory of that. I think I was in middle school at the time, and it'd be interesting. So that was RFK Jr.'s uncle, who apparently started that and was still in place in the early 70s. And the idea of bringing fitness back into schools, this is not a bad idea, is it?
But I think that what we're coming to understand in science, and there's a huge body of evidence now that supports this, is that ultra-processed food, which is really defined by this NOVA classification that degrades food on how processed it is. Like, tomato can is processed, but it's minimally processed. Whereas, a Twinkie is extremely processed, and it's made up of deconstructed food ingredients that are originally food, but then they deconstruct them into these molecular science projects and they reassemble them to look like something you could eat, but they're not really food by definition. And that has been driving the epidemic of obesity, diabetes, all these chronic illnesses.
Yeah, so the classification of ultra-processed food is kind of in its infancy, I'd say, or toddlerhood. I would love to see a randomized trial of telling people not to eat ultra-processed food and see what happens. So this is now, if you claim or blame ultra-processed food but don't have any sort of practical science that shows targeting it will improve your health, that's really kind of going back to that old food pyramid idea where it was never studied. It was rolled out to the public without any randomized trials showing how it would help people's health. So targeting something and then knowing what to do with that information in terms of telling people what to do are two very different things. But I have to say that junk food, ultra-processed food, sugar really is a root cause, if not the root cause, for most chronic medical conditions today. And most doctors don't know that. They're just not trained in that, and they don't have the clinical experience that Dr. Hyman and I and other doctors using these techniques have. They don't have that kind of background or understanding of it.
For every 10% of your diet that's ultra-processed food, your risk of death goes up by 14%. And it's 60+% of our diet as adults and 67% of kids' diets. And we're really now going to see in the next generation the serious consequences, because our kids, like you mentioned, are all coming into adulthood sick and overweight and on lots of medications.
Yeah, I would, my inclination is to give people good information and at the same time maximize freedom. So I wouldn't tell people what to eat and what not to eat.
Well, so the idea that we don't have a national guideline of what to eat, I love it. So actually the ideas I hear so far are excellent. Targeting a root cause of bad food. Basically, bad food requires doctors to give medications. And then changing radically or just eliminating a national guideline until you have science behind what is a good guideline to have going forward makes a lot of sense to me. And then even directing an organization like NIH and even directing an organization like NIH to put out requests for proposals, RFPs or RFAs, looking at how to communicate that this kind of food is not healthy, or actually then to see if health improvements can be made in different populations. Can you reverse type 2 diabetes by giving a message of reducing ultra-processed food? We don't have that information yet. Although giving a message about low-carb diets, we know, reduces the type 2 diabetes. We have clinical trials and we have clinical experience in clinics around the country showing that. And even yet, that's different than giving a nationwide proclamation of what to do. So that even the knowledge in the clinic like mine doesn't necessarily translate into a population-based sort of message. that kind of research should be funded urgently.
And that's how you really change policy, just like we did with the Monsanto case. We
Yeah,
got
I
a
agree.
critical threat. We got a critical threshold of studies, and animal studies, observational studies, epidemiological studies, bench studies that showed that glyphosate was causing non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in Roundup. And before that, if you were the president of the United States and you tried to ban Roundup, you would go nowhere.
So here, switching to a herbicide, a weed killer, as a basis of a kind of cancer, it's really not easy to prove that. And there is a legal case precedent or a way you can have a judge rule that there is a problem here. But that's not like doing clinical randomized controlled trials and studies that would be needed for FDA approval of a drug, for example. So I like the idea of taking a diet and studying it as if it were a drug and using the same kind of rubric or approval process that the FDA would use. When you're coming up with a glyphosate or Roundup as a problem for cancers, it's a different kind of thing because you're not going to be randomizing people to the exposure or not. So I'm afraid you can't be quite as certain unless it causes that in 100% people who are exposed. It's not quite, it's nowhere near that potent. But you can see that the background of RFK Jr. was to take a legal stance against the government, for example, that doesn't want to change certain rules, or against a company that is giving something that we think is causing health problems.
But if you have enough science to get past the Daubert threshold, which is a threshold in federal courts that where the judge has to make an independent judgment that there's sufficient science, critical mass of science, 15, 20, 25 studies out there that show the link between this exposure and this illness.
Yeah.
That's called Daubert. And the judge is not allowed to send it to a jury until you have that package of science. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to provide that enough science, sufficient science on each one of these exposures and each one of these injuries to show who's causing what and hold them responsible in court.
Yeah, so that's a different tack, looking at exposure, chemicals that are used. To say that having just 15 studies or 20 studies or 25 is, to me, not so important as what is the level of evidence of the studies that there are. A lot of exposure, correlation, not causation. If you've watched my channel, we've talked about nutritional epidemiology and how very small differences are trumpeted as huge, meaningful things, when even at best, the nutritional epidemiology is correlation, not causation. So there's a difference between looking at different diets and implementing things and then eliminating potential toxins. It's a different kind of approach.
I think that's so important, Bobby, because this has been so neglected in the National Institute of Health budget. There's really almost nothing for nutrition research, which is the biggest driver of so much of the things we're talking about: the chronic illness, the obesity, the diabetes, the mental health crisis. And yeah, there are other issues you mentioned, environmental chemicals, various kinds of stresses and so forth that are there, things like glyphosate affecting your microbiome. But the ultra-processed food is something that we really haven't doubled down and studied. And it's driving all the other diseases. So at the NIH, they study cancer and they give you $6 billion for that, or heart disease or diabetes, but they're not studying the root causes. And I think in medicine, we're really so focused on the downstream things that we can treat with the medication rather than the upstream root causes.
I totally agree. And a lot of change could happen just by changing the budget, changing the focus of who gets paid and who gets paid to do what sort of science. A lot of researchers, I think, would become nutrition experts if there was a lot of money available for nutrition research.
Which shows the damage of ultra-processed food, where we're paying of our $100 billion a year SNAP bill, which is a food stamp, that most of that is for junk food and ultra-processed food, which we know is killing people, and 10% is soda. Then we're paying for that on the back end with Medicaid and Medicare for all the chronic disease. We're also seeing the challenges of the capture of not just the agencies like the FDA and the USDA and HHS and EPA and CDC, but also Congress. I sat down with a congressman the other day who got excited about what I was talking about. I met with him about our Food Fix campaign to try to transform our food system and actually have reimbursement for nutrition, healthcare, and many other efforts. And he lost 25 pounds by following the suggestions.
Yeah, so the narrative that's being told, and there is truth to it, is that the food industry through government programs is giving bad food, the ultra-processed food, if you want to call it that, so that you're even getting people who are unable to pay for their own foods, giving them bad foods. And I do remember some years ago in the school system that the USDA surplus was being sent to schools so that if it was carbs, that's what the school would feed to the children. They didn't have to pay any money for it. So guidelines and the food subsidies, extra food gets put into different areas like the schools. And then the idea that the SNAP or the food stamps programs are also funneling around sugar and other bad foods. In fact, Professor Lustig at the University of California, San Francisco, talks about the moment that he had was when a farm worker came up to him and said, why does SNAP or food stamps allow us to have this sugary beverage for my children? And the child was not healthy. And it came to his awareness that we needed to change something in this providing food to people for low or no cost. It really should be healthy food. Otherwise, you're just perpetuating this problem.
You're not helping it to tell mothers, you're not helping your mother, your children, feed them Fruit Loops. You are not doing what a parent ought to do to give your kids dyes and sugar, a mixture of dyes and sugar and high fructose corn syrup.
Yeah. And right now I'm in South America, Bobby, and all the labels on the foods, they're all clear. Green is good for you. Yellow, caution. Red, this is bad for you. And anybody can understand that, even if you have no education. With currently our FDA labeling is so confusing, you have to be a nutrition PhD to understand it. And even then you can't really get it. So we have to change labeling. We have to change marketing. We have to change research infrastructure. We have to change how we're reimbursing healthcare services to incentivize doctors and healthcare providers to provide nutrition services and deal with the root causes. And right now we don't do that.
Well, that certainly is looking at the big picture view of how you change everything. Right now you can look at a food label and just look at the total carbohydrate. Look at the number of grams, G means grams, after total carbohydrate. And that will actually screen out ultra-processed foods. It'll screen out foods that are high in sugar. That is using today's FDA or nutrition facts label, and you can navigate the foods that are out there now. Although most healthy foods don't even have a label. So, I wish ground beef would say great for low carb diets, or, ground beef, great for keto diets. That instead we have the kind of Fruit Loop keto cereal, which now is really kind of a keto junk food at the moment. But so I agree, though, that change can be made. The medical system is reactive, not preventive. And really, the issue is that it lies with food and nutrition. And the top-down idea of telling people what to eat, I don't think is a great idea, like RFK Jr. said at the beginning of this interview.
You can get paid for doing a stent, but you can't pay for doing an intensive lifestyle care program like we do at Cleveland Clinic, where we're reversing diabetes, reversing heart disease, reversing these chronic illnesses using food as medicine. So it seems to be one of the central things that we can do to radically shift our trajectory in America, which is, like I said, we're, I think, 60th or worse in our life expectancy, despite spending twice as much as any other nation on healthcare.
Yeah, and then the other thing I'm going to do is just to change the corporate culture at these agencies.
Well, that was excerpt from an interview that Dr. Mark Hyman did with RFK Jr. when he was a presidential candidate earlier this year. The entire interview is fascinating. If you want to watch that, there'll be a link down below. And the idea of changing the food for human health is necessary. And it's not in the medical system. So you can't wait for the medical doctors or even medical researchers. Their mindset is not into prevention and nutrition. and changing the budget or changing the focus of these organizations, the U.S. government can make big change by funding research or pilot programs to test things before widespread implementation. We don't want a low-fat food pyramid disaster that happened, which, I hope you don't even remember what that shape was. And why is the government in the idea of giving guidelines in the first place? I don't think these guidelines are healthy or helpful, and I wonder if we need them at all. I hope that's helpful. If you like, please like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, and look out for new content twice a week. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and check out adaptyourlifeacademy.com.